combination of what I was just discussing with the deeply ingrained hatred of the Jews, suspicion of the Jews, these charges that build on each other, combined with the very skillful manipulation of the media and public opinion in general by the Islamic groups and their leftist allies. So the two come together, the left and the Muslims, on the basis of a shared hatred for America and Israel. And Zohran Mamdani embodies both. They killed 1.5 million Armenians, 1 million Greeks, and 300,000 Assyrians. And a lot of those people who were killed in gas chambers. The Turks were the first to use them.
Hello, and welcome to the Viktor Frankl Podcast. I'm Lori Fein, here with my co-host, Rabbi Daniel Schonbuch. And we're excited to have with us today our guest, Robert Spencer. Robert is an expert in Islam and Islamic jihad, and he has a brand new book out called Anti-Semitism, History and Myth. Robert, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. Thanks very much.
You know, when we were prepping for the show, I couldn't help but notice that you have elicited especially strong reactions among your detractors. You have been banned from Great Britain by the conservatives, by the conservative, before she was prime minister, Theresa May. You were drugged by people who, by your audience. You had the ADL and the Southern Poverty Law Center, two civil rights groups, call you a hate group, call your group a hate group. What brings this on? What makes you so controversial?
I've often wondered that myself, and it's really down to the fact that I enunciate some truths that are unpopular, but for all that, they are truths. They're readily demonstrable. I am ready to defend them in any forum. And so I would respectfully say to the government of Britain, to the ADL, to everybody that you mentioned, that there's no substance to their criticism. I don't advocate for any kind of violence or illegality. I don't actually have a program at all. I'm just pointing out what is quite obviously a threat, has been a threat for 1,400 years, is a threat in particular to Jews as well as to Christians, as well as to Hindus for that matter. And so this is something that we need to be aware of and not sweep under the rug. And yet nowadays, there are powerful forces in the world who have skillfully convinced large segments of the population that to speak about this threat is tantamount to committing a terrible, unpardonable act of bigotry and racism, even though neither one of them are really legitimately at play in this discussion. And consequently, they have demonized me on those points. But as I say, I don't think there's any substance to what they say.
Yeah. Robert, I want to just jump in about your book, Anti-Semitism, History and Myth. I mean, it's quite a masterpiece. I want to congratulate you on the amount of research you've done, the amount of footnotes in the book. So congratulations to you. I want to jump in because there's so much you talk about pagan anti-Semitism, Christian anti-Semitism, Islamic anti-Semitism, left anti-Semitism, right-wing anti-Semitism. I want to start with the latest manifestation in the media, which is captivating everybody's attention. It's, I believe, the blood libel, that Jews are willfully killing babies and starving babies now. I mean, Hamas is using this very effectively in the media. It's kind of the talk of the town. Could you just talk about the roots of that blood libel and how it's manifest today in politics and in the media?
Well, it's noteworthy that you point out the connection immediately by calling what is being done today a blood libel, because of course that's exactly what it is, but it highlights the fact that this is not a new charge, that these are charges that go back 1,000 years in medieval Europe, where children on several occasions, 700, 800 years ago, went missing, were found dead, and the local Jewish community, because it was already marginalized and despised, was a convenient scapegoat, even in the absence of any actual evidence that any Jews had had any involvement in the death of the child in question at all. And this became something of a social contagion, like many that we have seen in the last few years, where one group of people in one village would say that the Jews had stolen a child and killed him, and then others would repeat the claim in another context. I show in the book that many of these not only were thinly sourced, but the confessions were extracted by means of torture. On at least one notable occasion, the accuser was found to have been covering up an illicit liaison that was involved with a theft ring that she was involved with in another town, and claimed that she had been kidnapped by Jews while she went missing. This kind of thing, unfortunately, has led to a deeply ingrained cultural reflex, you could say, that blames Jews for this kind of behavior. And so I think it was all too easy for the jihadis and their allies, when the Gaza war started, to make claims about children being killed, because they knew they would resonate with people coming out of this kind of cultural context. But it's really kind of ridiculous when you look. For example, I just finished a new book that'll be out soon about Zohran Mamdani, the mayor candidate in New York. And he's on record claiming that the Jews were committing genocide in Gaza within a couple of weeks of the October 7th massacre, when the IDF had barely gone into Gaza at all. But it's just something that he knew would resonate. Obviously, it has. And the evidence doesn't have to be there, because these kinds of charges have been built up. And once you have, it's kind of like, what we started out with talking about in my case, and all these people say that I'm this terrible person. Once the ball gets rolling in that direction, then it's easier for others to pile on. And so what's happened to me is kind of in microcosm, not to say that, not to minimize the suffering of the Jews over the centuries, but it's the same kind of accumulation of false charges, with one building on another.
Well, let's talk about that reaction to October 7th for a second, because you also were very prominent in the aftermath of 9/11. And I think few people talk about it, but the reactions were so very different. After 9/11, you had an Islamic attack on really the center of power and money. What was more symbolic of that than the Pentagon and the World Trade Center? And yet you had a worldwide coalition to counterattack, to build up, and to fight a war that lasted years and had hundreds of thousands of casualties, of civilian casualties. And at the same time, when you had 10/7 and the attack was on babies thrown into oven and teenage girls being raped, and really people without power, but with much more of a sense of innocence, you could say, and civilians themselves were attacked. You had no one in the world lining up to support Israel, and you had immediately on college campuses and in governments worldwide condemning Israel and warning them not to retaliate. Why the big difference? Why is one side worth retaliating and one takes the blame before they even get started?
Well, you got the combination of what I was just discussing, with the deeply ingrained hatred of the Jews, suspicion of the Jews, these charges that build on each other, combined with the very skillful manipulation of the media and public opinion in general by the Islamic groups and their leftist allies. And the Islamic groups, very skillfully since 9/11, even before that in many ways, have been portraying themselves as the innocent victims of a media campaign, which is much like what we see actually conducted against the Jewish people worldwide. But that's in a classic case of projection. They claim that they are being victimized and vilified in this way themselves, and that any criticism of Islam, of jihad, even of concrete actions such as October 7th, is a manifestation of an Islamophobia that all decent people have to reject. And so the only thing left is to see the other side as being a common enemy that all of us need to unite against, because they are the real source of the evil. The Islamic rhetoric and the leftist rhetoric before October 7th and after has been consistent that whatever victim group is the designated chosen one at any given moment, it is sinless and constantly sinned against. And so the Gazans, they have not done anything. And the rapacious IDF war machine has committed occupation and genocide and all these false charges. And that because of the deeply ingrained idea by now that, yes, the Muslims are indeed innocent victims of Islamophobia. They were the worst victims of 9/11 because they were the ones who really suffered in its aftermath. And this kind of thing having become so deeply ingrained, it became very easy after October 7th to say, well, you've got Muslims on the one side, Jews on the other. Obviously, the Jews must be at fault.
How did it become so deeply ingrained? And how can we attack that? I mean, we have, at universities and in the media and in our government, we have many people who deeply believe this. And you've said yourself that we have allowed the messaging is almost more dangerous than the physical attacks. How did that come to be? And why was it able to slip in? And what can we do?
It demonstrates the power of propaganda. That they've been lying to people for all these decades, and nobody ever raised a dissenting voice. After all, all of these things are all tied together. I've been calling attention to these things for over 25 years. And yet, if you go to, as you noted, if you go to Google and do a search, all you get is what a terrible person I am. And it's not just me. You can search anybody who has been calling attention to these issues over the last quarter century, and it's the same treatment. So what the Islamic groups and the leftist groups did was destroy, essentially, anybody who was telling the truth about these issues and exalted people who were lying about them. So that now the American people and really the people of the world do not have the ability to evaluate this question from an objective standpoint. All they hear is one side, and the other side, well, they know those are bad people that they shouldn't listen to. And so they don't. And so these kinds of things all tie together. The only thing we can do in the face of that is continue to tell the truth about the reality of Islamic jihad, the fact that the Palestinians are the ones with the genocidal imperative, not the Israelis, the fact that there is no genocide in Gaza. Continue to pound home these truths in whatever forum we possibly can. But we have to be realistic about the fact that we're facing immense obstacles because the liars have so much more power and access and influence. And anybody who points out that they are liars and that they're actually the ones of low character that we should not be listening to, well, they're already on the ADL list or the Southern Poverty Law Center list or whoever's list. And so we can dismiss all that.
So let's go back to telling the truth. I'd like to give some historical context because you're quite the author on the topic of historical context to, let's call this Islamic anti-Semitism. I don't think most Americans are aware of Hamas's charter. And I want to just read from it for one moment. The Hamas charter in Article 7 basically says as follows: "The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews. When the Jew will hide behind stones and trees, the stones and trees will say, 'O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me. Come and kill him.' Only the Garkan tree, evidently a certain kind of tree, would not do that because it is one of the trees of the Jews." Robert, let me ask you about that. What's the context? Where is Hamas getting this from, this concept? Can you go back to the roots of Islamic anti-Semitism for our audience?
Absolutely. Yes, Rabbi, that, of course, is a quotation from Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. It is not something that was devised by Hamas, although I often see it quoted as if Hamas made it up. because it's in the Hamas charter. But actually, you will find this quotation in the canonical Hadith collections, that is, reports of Muhammad's words and deeds that are considered authoritative for Islamic belief and practice. And consequently, it is a central aspect of Islamic belief that what the tradition actually says is the last day will not come until Muslims kill Jews. And so if any Muslim wants to bring about the last day, the judgment day, the consummation of all things, the end of the world, if any Muslim wants to bring that about, he can kill Jews, and that will help bring it about. So this creates the idea that killing Jews is not just a matter of politically trying to gain an advantage over Israel and ultimately destroy it. It is an eschatological and spiritual imperative. And it is nothing less than an act of worship, as Hamas has said on more than one occasion, that Allah has made killing Jews an act of worship for them. And so this is not something that is peripheral or will end with some kind of negotiated agreement. This is a war that will continue as long as there are people who believe in Muhammad and Islam and the Quran.
So let's go back a little bit before that. Let's go back to Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, meeting with Hitler. And in that historical context, too, around that same period, the forming of the Islamic Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood. So can you talk about these two things in the earlier 20th century, which kind of lead up to what we're seeing in Hamas today?
Absolutely, yeah. The Muslim Brotherhood, it must be understood, was formed in order to create a global Muslim state. Now, it might seem totally fanciful and absolutely beyond belief that anybody would think, yes, we're going to unify all the Muslims in the world into one, excuse me, into one big mega state. And it's likely never to happen. But that is the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood because of the idea of the caliphate. The caliphate is the global Muslim community, the political entity to which all Muslims must belong according to Islamic law. The caliph, the word caliph, khalifa, means successor. And the successor, the caliph, is the successor of Muhammad as the political, military, and spiritual leader of all the Muslims worldwide. After Muhammad, there was the period of the four so-called rightly guided caliphs. Then there was the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate, and all of those claimed, although of course in practice none of them attained it, but all of them claimed to be the single global government for all Muslims worldwide. Now, in 1924, the secular Turkish government abolished the caliphate. And this is where all the jihad terror groups in the world, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Hamas and Hezbollah, every last one of them, they say that's where our troubles began. Because the Muslim world was thrown into a disunity that limited its power. And that what we need to do is reunite the Islamic world, restore the caliphate, and then we can wage jihad against Israel and the rest and destroy the enemies of Islam. So in 1928, 4 years after the abolition of the caliphate, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded in Egypt in order to restore the caliphate. It has obviously not succeeded yet in doing so, but it is now a global movement and is working all around the world to attain this goal. The Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, calls itself the Muslim Brotherhood for Palestine. And so theoretically, Hamas is not even working for a Palestinian state. It is working to make Israel, to destroy Israel and make the area in that Israel inhabits be part of the Islamic world again, so that it will ultimately be part of the global caliphate that the Muslim Brotherhood wants to establish. Now, this means that every jihad terror group is working in the same way in various countries around the world, not just to commit acts of mayhem and terrorism for their own sake, but to weaken and destabilize the governments of the various states in which they're operating so that they can be destroyed and a Muslim government put in their place. And ultimately, the idea would be to unite all these Muslim governments into one under the restored caliphate. So Hamas has to be understood as being part of this global movement. And that not only means that the Palestinian struggle, the jihad, becomes a global imperative, as we are seeing, particularly since October 7th, but also that all the other Muslim states have a certain obligation to fight against Israel, against the Israeli state, and try to destroy the Israeli state as the vanguard of this global effort to reunite the Muslim communities into one single ummah.
So are all of the academics, the leaders of our universities, the leaders of our governments, the leaders of half of Europe, are they just fools who fall for these lies? Or do you think there's something else at play?
Yeah, they're fools who falls for. There are, in other words, there is a large number of fools who fall for these lies, but there are also many who are bought, because if you look at the donations to American universities, some of the leading American universities, Harvard, Georgetown, MIT, the list goes on and on and on, and also lesser universities, they're getting millions and millions of dollars from the government of Qatar. Now, what is also the government of Qatar involved in? Sponsoring the Muslim Brotherhood. It's the chief state sponsor of the Muslim Brotherhood in the world today. And so you've got this Muslim Brotherhood supporting entity that harbored and still harbors probably the Hamas leaders who are surviving. Remember them celebrating in Doha when they saw the October 7th attacks unfolding. And they are funding American universities. And so when Qatar gives money, they expect you to give them the results. They're buying something. And what they're buying is not disinterested academic inquiry. What they're buying is support for the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. And the portrayal of these things, not as this imperialistic effort to destroy non-Muslim states and create a global Islamic entity, as I just explained, but they situate it in terms that the American left can understand, that these are the oppressors and these are the oppressed. The Israelis are oppressing the Palestinians. If you're on the side of the oppressed peoples of the world, the indigenous peoples of the world against white settler colonialists, then you have to support the Palestinians. It's all nonsense, and none of it actually applies in this case, because the Israelis are not white settler colonialists by any stretch of the imagination, but are actually the indigenous people of the land. But none of that is taught in the universities. This propaganda point that coalesces with what is being taught in the universities, and the university's tendency toward Marxism is being taught, and that's why it all is being played out today, starting from the university campuses. Those are the epicenters of the Qatari funding.
I think you bring up an excellent point about the money, and also even the Marxism. You know, Marxism is a materialist philosophy, as is capitalism. They both essentially say that people care about their material world. And it strikes me that that whether you're talking about the socialist leaning leadership or whether you're talking about the capitalist leaning leadership, both are somewhat ill-prepared to accept that there's an ideological motive not related to the physical world, not related to lifestyle or ownership or having a great economic situation.
Yeah, there's an ideological motive that's completely ignored. That's really what's so amazing to me, even after all these years, that every last communique from Mahmoud Abbas, from the Hamas leaders, from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, from Hezbollah, from Iran, they all mention Islam. When they talk about Israel, they talk about Islam. They understand Israel in an Islamic context that I have tried to explain here in brief. that Israel is an insult to Islam, an affront to Islam, because any land that belonged to the Islamic world at any time belongs by right to the Muslims forever. That's a concept that's based on the Quranic statement, drive them out from where they drove you out. So, that being the case, every point of their opposition is based on Islam. Iran has no beef with Israel otherwise. Iran has no border with Israel, no border dispute, no economic dispute, no economic competition. Why does Iran hate Israel? Because of Islam, because of the Islamic imperative. It's an Islamic republic. And so they read the Quran. It says, drive them out from where they drove you out. They think, well, we have to destroy Israel because that was Islamic land. I'm not even talking about 1948. I'm talking about the Ottoman Empire and the conquest by the Arabs of the area that is now Israel in the 7th century. And because it was ruled by Islamic law, it belongs to them forever. So all that is made very clear, abundantly clear, and repeatedly clear by all the leaders in the Islamic world and all the leaders of the Palestinians. And yet it is the one aspect of this conflict that is completely ignored and never mentioned, not even once, in Washington or in Europe or at the UN, anywhere. They do not discuss the Islamic aspect of this conflict that is so central to the other side. They never mention it. They act like it doesn't exist. At Camp David, in Oslo, every last accord, Islam has no mention, has no role. And so the West is trying to pretend that this is a political dispute that can be solved in the ordinary political ways. And it is not, and never has been. It is a religious dispute that cannot be solved by a political solution. And the religious dispute is consistently, steadfastly ignored by everybody who has ever had a role in trying to solve this problem.
What is the solution then? If people can't recognize it, and if people do not see what it is, what are we supposed to do, the few people who do see it?
Well, I'm sorry to say there is no solution. There is only management of the problem. Because as long as there are believers in Islam, believers in the Quran and Muhammad, there will be people who think they have to wage jihad against Israel and destroy it. If Israel were the size of a postage stamp, there would still be people who thought that. Because the whole thing, they have to drive them out. So, the only thing we can do is manage it. Islamic law teaches you do not wage jihad against an enemy who has more than twice your strength, and you have no chance of winning. That's not just political, that's not just military strength. That's also political strength and the willingness to stand by your principles and not compromise them and give away at the negotiating table what you've won on the battlefield. And so that kind of strength needs to be recovered. Also, there needs to be a certain kind of pressure that can be exerted and should be exerted on the Arab states. After all, Egypt has been paid billions of dollars since the Camp David Accords were concluded in order not to go to war with Israel. And yet the Egyptian government has allowed for a massive spread of anti-Semitic material, including even Mein Kampf, which is a consistent bestseller, throughout their country for decades, in violation of the specific words of the Camp David Accords. The American government can and should exert pressure on Egypt and on Jordan and on every state there that gets American money, which is pretty much all of them, and say to them, look, the Palestinians don't exist. You know it, and we know it. We've been pretending all these years. We're going to stop pretending. You know and we know that the Palestinians were invented by Yasser Arafat and the KGB in 1964 as a propaganda tactic, and it's worked great, but it's over. We're dealing with Arabs here who are not different linguistically, culturally, politically, or religiously from the Arabs of Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, and only slightly different from those of Egypt. And so you have some refugees. I don't mean the UN's list of refugees, which is the children and grandchildren of refugees and great-grandchildren. I mean, you have a dwindling number of people who actually left in 1948. Now, we're going to leave aside for the moment the fact that the Arab Higher Committee actually ordered the Arabs to leave in 1948, and that the vast majority of those who left were not driven out by the IDF. But leave that aside. Let's take every last one of those people, the surviving elderly people who left in 1948, and call them refugees. Now, they are Arabs. Take them in. Every refugee crisis, every refugee situation that has ever happened in the history of the world has been solved by the people who are refugees going to live elsewhere. And sometimes it may seem unkind and harsh. There were Germans who had lived in Königsberg, and their families had lived in Königsberg for centuries. And then Königsberg was taken after World War II and given to the Soviets. Why? Because the Germans started an aggressive war and lost it. And it's a rule of warfare from time immemorial that a country that starts an aggressive war and loses it may end up losing territory to the victorious countries in order to protect themselves against further such attacks. That's happened everywhere in human history. There are hundreds of examples. I'm giving you Germany after World War II because it's ready to hand, and most people are aware that it happened. You look at a map of Germany in 1939, it's substantially larger than Germany in 1945. Why? Because they started a war and lost it. So, why does this not apply to Israel? Because of this deeply ingrained hatred of Jews that we've been discussing. There's no other reason why Israel cannot and should not control those territories that it won in aggressive wars against it, wars it did not start, but it did not lose. And the Arabs absorbed the Germans who lived in Königsberg. They went to live in Germany, what was left of it. Or they went to live somewhere else. They moved to America, whatever. And nobody's whining about German refugees today. And there's no UN agency calling the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those people refugees. Why do the Palestinians get a different treatment? You take them and you call upon those countries to settle them in a peaceful and humane manner and give them gainful employ. And you even fund the operation. So nobody can charge that this is anything inhumane that's being done. Why should this be treated so differently from every other refugee problem if they don't want to live in Israel? Otherwise, if they want to be loyal to the Israeli state, there are plenty of Arabs in Israel now who have no discrimination, no apartheid, none of that nonsense. They have full equal rights with the Israelis. So you want to join the Israeli state? Great. You want to go live in Syria? Great. But you're not going to have your Palestinian state because there are no Palestinians. It's a fiction. We're calling it out.
So this concept, let's call it Palestinianism, is really just a method to really destroy the Jews. It has no real historical roots. You mentioned in your book, if you look at the names
the only reason
of many Palestinians, their last names are referring to countries they come from, like Egypt, like Syria, like the Maghreb. So really, that's what it exists for. And let's not forget that Jews lived in Arab lands for many years with tremendous anti-Semitism. And in 1948, over 850,000 Sephardic Jews were kicked out of their countries as well. So you talk about some of the historical roots. What was it like for Jews pre-Israel to live in the Mandate of Palestine? We're talking about the 1929 massacres in Hebron and in other countries around the Middle East as well.
Yeah, it's really shameful. It's a shameful history because the British get credit for fostering the establishment of the State of Israel because the League of Nations, the Ottoman Empire ceded the territory to the League of Nations as the Ottoman Empire was dissolving. The League of Nations gave it to Britain as the mandate for Palestine for the creation of a Jewish national home. And the British administered it for 28 years from 1920 or 26 years from 22 to 48. And then the Jewish national home, the Israeli state, was founded. But what is lesser known, I discuss in an earlier book I wrote, The Palestinian Delusion, that the British tried everything they could to stop Jewish immigration to Palestine, to stop the creation of the Jewish national home. They even went so far as to tell Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who you mentioned earlier, who went and worked with Hitler and the Nazis during World War II. When he was in Jerusalem in the 1920s, in 1921 and 22, the British told him, if you carry out some pogroms against the Jews, we will not prosecute you, we will not arrest you, you'll have free reign, because we want to discourage the Jews from coming to this area. And he agreed. And so you have the Hebron massacre, you have so many other massacres that happened under his auspices, with the British turning a blind eye after that, all through the 1920s and 30s.
Yeah, it would even seem that, according to your book, Haji Amin al-Husseini was actually advising Hitler
Oh,
on the
yeah, that's
destruction
right.
of the Jews.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that there was all sorts of confusion, or I should say disagreement, among the National Socialist High Command as to what to do about the Jews.
Yeah.
Haj Amin al-Husseini served in the Turkish military during World War I, and the Turks at that time were carrying out the Armenian genocide, as well as the genocide of the Greeks and the Assyrians. They killed 1.5 million Armenians, 1 million Greeks, and 300,000 Assyrians. And a lot of those people who were killed in gas chambers. The Turks were the first to use them. Now, the Nazis, they didn't know what to do with the Jews. They had completely disenfranchised and dehumanized them, barred them from various professions, barred them from various sectors of public life, but they're still there in Germany, completely impoverished, completely dependent upon the state. And the German state obviously did not want them. So there was the plan to deport them all to Madagascar. But the war broke out. That became impossible because the Germans did not have command of the seas to deport hundreds of thousands or millions of people all that way to southeast Africa. So, or the island off Southeast Africa. So then they come up with the final solution. And we start seeing the death camps with the gas chambers. Where did they get this idea? That all is unclear. But Hitler at this point is saying that people are saying history will judge us harshly. Actually, that's not the case, Hitler said. After all, nowadays, who remembers the Armenians? Where did he get the idea? Why was he thinking of the Armenians in the context of what he was doing? Haj Amin al-Husseini did not just have one meeting with Hitler and then he went home. He lived in Berlin from 1941 to 45. He was very close to Himmler and to Adolf Eichmann. And he, at one point, wrote a very angry letter because he had heard that a boatload of Jews were being deported to Palestine. And he said, you've got to turn this boat back. We don't want them in Palestine. You've got to think of some other way to deal with them. We will not accept them in Palestine, and this could very severely imperil our cooperation. And this was serious for the Germans because he had raised up 2 Waffen-SS divisions out of Bosnian Muslims in the Balkans. So they didn't want to lose the Arabs. He was also preaching to the Arabs in Arabic that they should join up with the Nazis. And they didn't want to lose this valuable ally. So they had to think of some other thing to do with the Jews. And it just happens that they hit upon the gas chambers, the same thing that Haj Amin al-Husseini had dealt with while serving with the Turks in World War I.
It's just so depraved and so disgusting to hear this history and to know that we're essentially seeing it all over again, where you have the collaboration of various groups in Europe and in the Middle East collaborating against the Jews and affirming Jewish murder.
Yes, it's deeply disturbing. That's one of the reasons why I wrote this book on anti-Semitism, to try to show the root causes of this and how dangerous it really is, and to counter this fashion of anti-Semitism that we see spreading around today. But it's the same thing, really, that we saw in the run-up to the Holocaust, because it is so many people working on their narrow self-interest without realizing the larger implications of what they're doing. Like you take, for example, the new push to create a Palestinian state with Carney of Canada and Macron of France and Starmer of the UK and Albanese and Australia, and they're all going to declare unilaterally that there's a Palestinian state, even though it doesn't have any borders or any government or anything really. And they just want to pacify the Muslims in their countries, which they've brought in large numbers, and make sure that they keep voting for their parties. But they're not realizing or not caring about the larger implications of what they're doing in terms of challenging the sovereignty of Israel and imperiling that sovereignty, calling for the dismemberment, most likely, of the Jewish state, so that a contiguous Palestinian state can be created. And it's all, of course, completely short-sighted in light of the fact that a Palestinian state is not going to pacify anything or end the jihad against Israel, because it is, as I explained before, based on religious imperatives that will not end with a political change.
Yes, and let's then pivot a little to the United States and the danger this anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism poses to the United States right now. We mentioned before, this alliance between the left and the Islamists. Let's call it the Red-Green Alliance. I've heard it been called that. And now we're seeing this embodied in Zohar Mamdani, basically. He is a perfect example of a person who till this day really denies, he will not, go against his statements in the past. He will not condemn the phrase globalize the intifada. And what it really took in the United States, or New York in specific, was him to unite with another group, which was the left, the far left, the Democratic Socialists of America. Can you please address that topic of this union between these two parties and the threat it poses now to New York and the rest of the country?
In the last day or two, we've seen that President Obama has reached out to him, and members of President Obama's support and team, David Axelrod. So if you could incorporate that into your answer as well, what you think of that.
Well, it's kind of ironic that Mamdani, he criticizes Andrew Cuomo, who's eminently worthy of being criticized. But Andrew Cuomo, supposedly in Mamdani's view, is the candidate of billionaires. And Mamdani is the candidate of the ordinary folks who have the little people who finally have their champion. It's really the same kind of rhetoric we've seen from Marxists throughout the history of Marxism, that they are for the people, when actually what they're for is for a massive federal state that controls every aspect of the people's lives and creates this governing elite that has privileges beyond that of the ordinary people. But what's ironic about it is that Mamdani is actually the candidate of billionaires himself, as he has accepted quite a lot of money from the Open Society foundations and organizations connected to the Open Society foundations of George Soros, and collected money as well from other very far left people in Hollywood and elsewhere who have multi-million-dollar bank accounts, and they're happy to fork over some of it to him because he shares their political perspective. So it's not as if he's not the candidate of the rich. He's just the candidate of a different group of rich people. But the left-green alliance, the red-green alliance in general, I think, is based on several pillars, one being hatred of America and Israel, and of the West in general. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, of course, is the old adage, I believe, from Chairman Mao. And it's in play in this case. The left, of course, is made up of socialist internationalists who hate America as the foremost nation state in the world today, and they hate Israel because of its irreducible particularity, that it's a Jewish state, it's a state of people who have been unwilling throughout history to assimilate into larger groups, and they're not going to join the socialist internationalist megastate in the aggregate either. And so consequently, the ire of the left is focused upon America and Israel in particular, and the ire of the Muslims also, because Israel stands as the foremost contradiction to the idea that Islam is perpetually in springtime. You know why so many Muslim flags of Muslim countries are green? Because Islam is in perpetual springtime. It's always growing. Green is the color of Islam because it's never in autumn. It's never in winter. Islam is always expanding. And so Israel is a contradiction to that. It's a land like Spain, it's a land that was once Islamic and is no more. That's a great insult to Islam. So the two come together, the left and the Muslims, on the basis of a shared hatred for America and Israel. And Zohran Mamdani embodies both. He's a Marxist, an avowed Marxist. He denies being a Marxist, but he's obviously a Marxist because he's on video saying the ultimate goal is seizing the means of production and so on. Clearly Marxist rhetoric. He's an open and unapologetic Twelver Shiite Muslim, the sect of Islam that is the leadership of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so those two things make him kind of the dream candidate for the far left. That not only is he a far leftist like they are, but he's a member of this special protected victim class that they love in particular because it's been the 1400-year enemy of the West. And they want to do away with the West and do away with the foremost nation states in the world, which are all in the West, or arguably mostly in the West. And so they see him as being the perfect candidate. And this is why he has so much media attention, so much backing from so many powerful people. He's just everything they want. He's not white. He's not American. So he doesn't have the original sins of the left. He's an immigrant from Uganda, from the third world. This just keeps getting better. His father's a communist professor at Columbia, and you know how Columbia is in terms of Jewish students. His mother is a famous filmmaker, multimillionaire filmmaker, who has made a lot of films that center around the evils of the West and racism and so on. And so he's got a perfect pedigree, he's got perfect beliefs, a perfect background, and a perfect agenda. Everything about him makes him the new rising star of the left. And so I don't see how he can possibly lose the race for mayor of New York. But if he does, his career will not be over. He'll be a star for years to come.
I hope this is the one thing that you're wrong about. It's been such a pleasure to have you here today.
Likewise.
And I really appreciate the things you're saying. I really want people to take to heart the importance of recognizing truth versus lies, because I think that's one of the most important things that you've said today, is giving us the real history, giving us the real truth about the situation, and framing the problem that's before us. I just hope you're wrong that we can't find a solution.
Well, like I say, it can be managed. There are ways to make this something. You look back 100 years ago, and the Muslim world was looking to the West. Ataturk in Turkey, the founder of modern Turkey, very bad guy in many ways, but he said Islam is what caused our troubles. It's why the Ottoman Empire fell. The West is victorious. We have to pattern the new Turkey after the West. The Shah of Iran, Reza Shah, the one before the one who was deposed, he followed Ataturk. The whole Islamic world was looking to the West. Then that all changed, and the West lost its self-confidence to a tremendous degree. But you didn't hear about jihad attacks on the streets of Paris in those days. And that kind of strength, I think, could be recovered and should be.
Robert, I want to ask you a final question. Many people assume that you're Jewish, and you've been attacked as being a Jew, but you're not. Your background is with the Greek Orthodox Church.
Yeah, that's right. My grandparents actually grew up in the Ottoman Empire and were exiled for declining to convert to Islam in the middle of World War I and came to the United States.
So I'm just wondering, what gives you the power, the courage, and honestly, the interest to do such incredible research and spend so much time writing books about Islam, the dangers of Islam, anti-Semitism. What's giving you the power to do that? Because you're such a special personality. We're just wondering where that's coming from.
Well, you're very kind. I think that my interest in Islam originally came from my family's background and the fact that I wanted to understand what had happened. Because my grandparents, when I would ask them about life over there, they would say how great it was. And then I said, "Well, why'd you leave? We were exiled." "Why were you exiled?" Then they would clam up. So I wanted to know, and that leads right into Islam and understanding the supremacist, aggressive, expansionist, and violent aspects of Islam. And then that, of course, became something that became a matter of general interest after 9/11, and I was writing about it. And that leads to understanding that Israel is on the front lines of the global jihad. And so if you're going to be against jihad, you can't really stand against Israel and favor that jihad. Although consistency, of course, is not something that is very important to a lot of people. It is to me. And so this is why I think it's very important to stand today with Israel and the Jews in general.
And if people want to find out more about your work, where should they go to?
I'm at jihadwatch.org. That's JIHAD watch.org. It is a news site about jihad activity updated many times daily at Jihad Watch RS on Twitter, and you can find all the books on Amazon. There are 32 of them. Get the whole set.
Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to having you back in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.